Good morning, everyone, on this getting slightly sunnier Friday morning. We'll just give it a minute or two just to let people into the room before we kick off our Human Rights in Action session. I'm happy to get things started because I know we'll have quite a bit to go through today. So good morning, everyone. My name is Meg. I am the Human Rights Lead at QCOS, and welcome to our Human Rights in Action session, the Supported Decision Making and the Public Trustee of Queensland. I would like to start today by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the original inhabitants of Australia and recognise these unique cultures as part of the cultural heritage of all Australians. We pay respect to the elders of this land, past and present. I'm presenting to you from Meanjin in Brisbane. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are facilitating this webinar, and that is the Turrbal and the Yuggera people, and I would like to pay my respects to those elders past and present. I especially welcome and pay respect to all First Nations people joining us on the line today. QCOS thanks the First Nations people for the gift of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and we look forward to supporting the work leading to a successful referendum to enshrine the First Nations voice to Parliament in the Australian Constitution, followed by Makarrata and Treaty. QCOS welcomes the invitation to walk with First Nations people. So if you could please take a moment using the chat function, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, that will be at the bottom hand screen, a little box that just says chat. You can let us know on which traditional lands you're dialing in on or where you're dialing in from. We've got a few people from across the state with us today. So it's lovely to hear the breadth of the country from which we're all meeting on. Bit of our session outline for you today. We're going to hear from two speakers. We have Professor Christine Bigby, who is the Director of LaTrobe University Living with Disability Research Centre, and she's going to talk to us about supported decision making and the framework around that. And we also have Samay Zhouand, the CEO and Public Trustee of Queensland, and he's going to talk to us about the Public Trustee and how they are making supported decision makings with their clients. And then if we've got time afterwards, we'll have a short Q&A session as well. I'll tell you a little bit about our speakers as well. So Professor Christine Bigby has a national and international reputation, if I can talk this morning, for her research on the social inclusion of adults with intellectual disability. The focus of her work is policy issues, program effectiveness, and frontline practice that supports quality of life outcomes for people with intellectual disabilities. She has gained over $10 million in competitive and industry funding, and her current grants are examining the effectiveness of supporting accommodation services, the nature and meaning of social inclusion for people with intellectual disability, and supported decision-making for people with a cognitive disability. She's a visiting professor of the Tizard Centre of the University of Kent, a fellow of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual Disability. She is a past chair of the IASSID Special Interest Group on Ageing and Intellectual Disability, a national board member of ASID, the Australian Society for Intellectual Disability, and she has done research to practice for founding editor of Research into Intellectual Disability, so RAPID, a foundation fellow of the Australian College of Social Work. She has published 8 books, 42 chapters, and 165 peer-reviewed journal articles. So Professor Bigby has been busy within her life. In March 2016, Professor Bigby was elected chair of the academic board, and she's held this position until March 2022. She was appointed as a member of the ARC College of Experts in 2018 and elected as president of ASID in November 2021. We also have Samay with us today, and Samay was born in Afghanistan, but as a young boy, he fled with his family to Australia in the early 80s. Samay was appointed the acting Public Trustee of Queensland and CEO in June 2019 and was permanently appointed to the role in 2021. Samay holds multiple qualifications, including a Bachelor of Law with Honours, a Bachelor of Arts, an MBA, and a number of postgraduate business qualifications. He has had nearly 25 years' experience in legal, accountability, governance, risk management, and decision-making roles across government. He's held a range of senior executive positions in Queensland government, including the longest-serving Chief Inspector of Corrective Services in Queensland and in senior legal roles in the former Department of Community of Safety. He's also worked as a senior lawyer for Crown Law and was admitted as a barrister at law in 2002. I was going to do a small bit of scene setting before we hand over to our amazing speakers for today as well. Just to give some context around what is substitute decision making and where this fits in. So capacity, QCAT, the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal, can appoint a substitute decision maker. A substitute decision maker can be appointed for both personal matters, and this role is often known as a guardian, and also financial matters, known as an administrator. Under Section 12 of the GAT Act, or the Guardianship and Administration Act, QCAT will make their decision to appoint a substitute decision maker if the adult has impaired capacity for the matter, there is a need for a decision to be made for an adult, or the adult is likely to do something that involves unreasonable risk to their health, welfare, or property, and without the appointment, the adult's needs won't be met and the adult's interests won't be protected. So capacity under the Guardianship Act means that a person is capable of understanding the nature and effect of the decision about the matter, that they can freely and voluntarily make decisions about the matter, and that they can communicate that decision in some way. Public trustee, if they are appointed as a substitute decision maker, similar to if the public guardian is appointed a guardian for matters, is known as a guardian of last resort or an administrator of last resort. This means that they would only be appointed as a financial administrator if there is no one more appropriate to be appointed. The public trustee can also be appointed as an attorney for financial decisions under an enduring power of attorney, but the adult must first have capacity to assign this. That's not a decision that QCAT itself makes. When looking at the public trustee and the financial decisions, that's defined under the Guardianship and Administration Act as well. So the types of decisions, if you want to look into that, are listed out under the Guardian and Administration Act in Schedule 2, Part 1, but it includes things such as paying maintenance or accommodation expenses for the adults, paying debts, including fees, receiving or recovering monies paid to the adult, carrying on trade or business, performing contracts, discharging mortgages, undertaking real estate transactions, and it also includes legal matters relating to finance or property. It's important to remember as well that when we're talking about these transactions, it's transactions that are utilising the funds of the person involved as well. This is not the bank of the public trustee, for instance, that can pay for things that are not related to the client themselves. I'm going to hand over to Professor Bigby to give us some scene setting and explanation around what is supported decision-making and the structured decision-making framework that's currently used by the public trustee. So thank you, Professor Bigby.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I should say I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Victoria, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to talk today about supported decision-making, which is often seen as the sort of flip side of substitute decision-making. But I think we're moving to a greater understanding about what supported decision-making is and seeing it much more as a continuum, so that some aspects of substitute decision-making can actually fit into that continuum of supported decision-making. So can I have the first slide? Okay, so most of the audience would be aware, I think, that there's been a significant shift in thinking about decision-making by and with people with cognitive disabilities since the UN Convention, which has really focused on the rights of people with disabilities to make decisions for themselves. So we've moved from thinking about individual capacity and spending a lot of time assessing whether somebody's got capacity or not, to thinking more about the right of everybody to participate in decision making and having the right type of support in order to do that, and thinking about the different ways in which people are able to be supported and are able to participate. And obviously that looks different for everybody. So this idea of having a substitute decision maker because somebody doesn't have capacity is sort of an anathema to supported decision making. So the idea of best interests, that somebody else would make a decision for you if you don't have capacity and they'd do it in your best interests, is sort of alien to this idea of supported decision making, which talks about substituted judgment, which says, well, if you're unable to articulate what your preferences might be, then we will, as substitute decision makers, try and make a judgment about what your preferences are. Rather than determining what's best for you, we will try and work out what it is that you want to have happen, which is this idea of substituted judgment that substitute decision makers are increasingly making rather than best interest type decisions. So the idea of supported decision making is that a person's will and preferences, so what they want in the short term and what their long-term intentions are, which is what the word will means, should be at the centre of all decisions that either they make or that are made in relation to them. And a lot of this work goes back in Australia to the conceptual work that was done by the Australian Law Reform Commission in 2014. And it set out 4 fundamental principles, which are still incredibly relevant today, which are about the equal right of people to make decisions, the right of people to be supported to make decisions, for will, preferences and rights to be at the centre of all decisions, but also for there to be safeguards in place so that abuse doesn't happen and supporters don't exploit and abuse people. But what's happened since that report in Australia has been very fragmented, and we've had a set of reforms that have been fairly disjointed. So different states have done different things, different public organisations have done different things across Australia. And there's the state Commonwealth, so the NDIS is Commonwealth, and that still really doesn't have a strong policy around supported decision making. There's been a whole range of pilots that have happened and various sort of ad hoc initiatives, but it's very hard at the moment to say across Australia that we've adopted supported decision making. So there's different expectations and different systems about who can provide support, what the standing and the recognition of supporters are, and what the expectations of substitute decision makers are. So in Victoria, we have one set of expectations from our law. In Queensland, you have a different set, and it's different again in New South Wales. So can I have the next slide? But there's been some very interesting reforms in Queensland, which really do reflect the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. You introduced a Human Rights Act some time ago, which gave the responsibility of the Queensland public sector to promote and safeguard human rights, and in a way that is really least restrictive. And that was then panned out into amendments to the Guardianship and Administration Act. And it introduced into your legislation, and it's really unclear why, but it introduced this idea of structured decision making, which public authorities must use to promote people's rights if they're involved in decision making. And it has these 4 imperatives that you must recognise and preserve people's rights to make their own decisions, that if it's possible to support an adult to make a decision, then you must do that, You must take account of people's views, their will, their wishes and preferences, and you should only use a substitute judgment if you can't determine somebody's preferences. Now that sounds incredibly similar to supported decision-making. In fact, the two are the same. And maybe at some point, Queensland might change some of its wording so that it sort of aligns with the current directions of reform and discussion. Can I have the next slide? But what we've seen is an awful lot of focus on the high level. What should we be doing? How should we be enforcing people's rights? What should that look like in legislation and policy? But from our research centre, we started to ask the question, and this is about 10 years ago, what does this mean in practice? What does it actually look like? How do people support other people to make decisions? So we've spent the last 10 years or so trying to develop what we've called now the LaTrobe Support for Decision-Making Practice Framework. So we're recognising that good support is central to supported decision-making, but that good support is really difficult to do. There isn't a formula for it. It's got to be tailored to each individual, and it's got to be tailored to each decision that you're supporting the individual to make. So for some people, one decision, the same decision might be easy, but for somebody else, that decision might be a really difficult decision. Some people may be really good at some decisions, but not so good at other decisions in their lives. So you can't sort of label somebody and say, you need this type of decision support, because the support somebody needs will vary according to the type of decision they've got to make. So what we set out to do really was to understand the process of decision support. How did supporters provide support to people? What did it feel like from people's perspective? And what did supporters do? And we followed a theoretical model that says you need to follow these steps in order to develop what it calls a complex intervention, which is support for decision making. So we started off looking at the evidence, and actually when we started, there was very little evidence about the processes of supported decision making. There was lots of psychological evidence about choice, but not much about supported decision making. So we reviewed the literature, and we also did a number of exploratory studies asking supporters what their experience of providing support was, and asking people with cognitive disabilities what that felt like and how they were supported. And from that work, we developed a framework, and we spent quite a lot of time then testing and piloting the framework with different sets of supporters to see if it worked for them, and revising it. And we ended up then with our framework, and we developed a set of training materials from that. And they're available online. There's a whole set of clips and illustrative scenarios which show you how to support people to make decisions in different situations. And since then, which was about 2018, I think, we've been trying to evaluate how effective the framework is. That if you're trained in the framework as a supporter, does it help you change the way you provide support? We've had three quite large studies on more than that are sort of interconnected, but have looked at family supporters, so people who are supporting either people with intellectual disabilities or people with acquired brain injury. We've looked at support coordinators, people who work for the Victorian Traffic Accident Commission, and we've also looked at the workers in the Queensland Public Trustee Office. So can I have the next slide? So this is the LaTrobe Support for Decision-Making Practice Framework. And obviously there isn't time today to go into great detail about this, but as I said, there's lots of material available that explains it. And I think the important thing to say is this looks like it's a set of steps. So you go around from 1 to 7. It doesn't work like that. It's a set of steps that you have to go through when you're supporting somebody to make a decision, but you go backwards and forwards between those steps rather than following them in a straight line. So the steps are, just very quickly, knowing the person. You can't support somebody to make a decision unless you know something or quite a lot about the person. And often you need to know that from different perspectives, because everybody knows people in different ways. Then you need to really be careful about identifying and describing the decision that you're supporting the person to make, and identifying were there decisions that had been made before that maybe need to be revisited. And often people aren't really clear sometimes what decision they are supporting somebody to make. So identifying it is really important. And then understanding what the options are about that decision. So what might you choose? What are the possibilities around that decision? And what are the person's preferences around each of those options? And for somebody with a cognitive disability, that may actually mean experiencing some of those options or explaining to somebody what they are and then letting them have that experience. Because many people with cognitive disabilities find it hard to think in abstract terms and may not have the experience to understand what it is that's being offered to them. So it's not a simple process, thinking about options and getting people to understand and think about what their preferences are. That step should then come before the next step, which is about, okay, so what are the constraints on somebody's decision? What are the constraints on the options? And how might we get around those? Too often people go to step 4 first and say, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you've only got this much money, therefore this is the option. Whereas if you think much broader in step 3 first, you're going to get more options. And then at the end of the day, you might turn out with a better decision because you can take some of those constraints into account. Then if you're in the community, the next step is about, is there a need for a formal process here? So does the supporter, do the supporters, if there's more than one supporter, agree? Is there cohesion between the supporters and the person, or is there conflict? Do people have differing ideas? Are people worried about harm? And if you're in that situation, then you might need to find a formal process. That could be a mediation, or it might mean going to the guardianship tribunal and trying to have somebody to mediate those conflicts. And that happens most often when there's conflict or when there's issues of risk and harm for somebody. Then you need to clearly reach the decision, and that's not the end of it, because there's lots of associated decisions that fall out of making one decision. So if you decide you're going to spend your money on renovating your house, then you've got to think about, well, which rooms am I going to renovate? How much is it going to cost? Which one's going to come first? There's lots of decisions that flow from that. And then the final step is implementing the decision. So a decision really isn't a decision until it's been implemented and put into practice. And for many people, it's hard for them to implement a decision themselves. And particularly people that rely on support workers often need advocacy support to get a decision implemented. So that's the sort of the last step. And what we suggest is that these 5 steps provide a really good checklist. Have you gone through these steps? If you're supporting somebody, can you explain what you did at each step? And they should be informed by 3 principles, which are really straightforward, about the commitment to somebody's rights, orchestration, which is about involving other people who know the person or other people who are experts about the content, and then reflecting and reviewing on the process that you've gone through. And clearly the strategies that you use are tailored to each individual. There isn't a list of strategies. You have to develop those strategies based on the steps and on the principles. So that's a very quick rundown of that. If I can have the next slide. So you might say, well, what's that got to do with the Queensland Public Trustee? Well, a couple of years ago, before Samay's time, the Queensland Public Trustee heard us speaking about this at the AGAT conference in Canberra before COVID, when we were doing it in person. And they said, well, we could take this supported decision-making framework and use it as a framework for decision-making that happens in the Queensland Public Trustee Office. So they adapted our model to call it structured decision-making in line with the Queensland legislation. And it's almost identical to our model but there's just some fairly minor changes in language, and there's some changes at various steps, particularly in step 5, which is about do you need a formal process? Well, you've already got a formal process in the Public Trustee Office, but it's a stop and reflect point where whoever's providing support needs to stop and reflect. Have we followed the process to date? And the step 7 for the public trustee is about actioning and evidencing. Have we documented and evidenced the decision that we've made? So the Queensland Public Trustee trainers spent a lot of time adapting our work and developing training that was more honed to the particular context of the Queensland Public Trustee. And I'm going to hand over to Samay now, who's going to talk a bit about what's happened there, and then I'll finish off and come back and talk a bit about the formal evaluation that we did of their work. So over to you, Samay.
Right. Thank you, Professor Bigby, and good morning, everyone. And I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. For me here, it's the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I just also want to thank Professor Bigby for explaining and developing the supported decision-making process, which since I've come on board in 2019, I've been very excited about and fully supported its implementation, and doing whatever we can and whatever I can to ensure that it is embedded in the DNA of our organisation. So just in terms of some context, for me, the supported decision-making framework is really about our obligation to ensure and to uphold the human rights of our customers in all of our actions and decisions. And we are the first public trustee in Australia to introduce this tool into our daily practices. And we're really excited about it. And we're working very closely with Professor Bigby to ensure that we continually evolve it. One of the dangers of having a tool such as this is that it can sometimes involve the risk of a set and forget approach. So for us, we've implemented it across the organisation, but we're also very mindful of continually monitoring it and continually adjusting it so that there is a continuous learning and improvement cycle. And we are working with Professor Bigby at the moment to continue to work on that. And now, in terms of the implementation, as Professor Bigby said, of this model into the Queensland Public Trustee, one of the key things we did was to ensure that we timed it right. And for us, timing was really about aligning it to the introduction of the Human Rights Act, as well as the introduction of the amendments to the Guardianship and Administration Act. So we made sure that those 3 key architectural pieces aligned, so they all commenced at the same time for us, which were really the Human Rights Act, the supported decision-making process, and the amendments to the Guardianship and Administration Act. So that it enabled us to really provide one set of concrete changes to staff, rather than necessarily hitting them with multiple changes over a period of time. But also it enabled us to really frame and really promote the change as an important obligation, as an important value for the organisation in terms of human rights and in terms of respecting the principle of maximising the rights and choices of our customers. And to date, the results have been very encouraging. Now, there will always be room for improvement, and there will always be individual cases where things can improve, and we're constantly looking for opportunities to identify those and to improve practices in that regard. But overall, what we found in terms of this supported decision-making framework or structured decision-making framework, however, whatever terminology one may want to use, is that it's really helped our organisation and what we deliver to our customers and to the community in a significant way. So, and I just want to talk about, 5 key areas where that has really helped us, and that might also help to explain, how it works on the ground for us. So the first thing the model has really helped us with is it has really enhanced collaboration and communication between our staff and with our customers. So what that has involved is really a greater focus on getting to know the customer through step 1 and setting them up for success right from the beginning. And as a result, we are engaging with the customers a lot more, which is fantastic. And also, as part of engaging with the support network, we are engaging a lot more with the family, with the friends, with the carers, with NDIS, right from the beginning. And what this has enabled is ultimately just a more coordinated service that we provide to customers. The second thing it's really helped us with is it has really helped with engendering a greater commitment by our staff for the model and for our customers, as well as it's ensured some consistency in decision making. Now, the model that Professor Bigby developed, and we incorporated it in line with our human rights legislation and the general principles, is that it's really provided a very safe and very progressive framework to help comply with all of our obligations and values. And ultimately what it has meant is that staff actually feel very committed to the process and very committed to the customers, because they see that it is making a difference and they see that it is directed for the benefit of our customers. So it's actually made staff really excited about their work and really excited about the fact that the daily decisions that they make are for the benefit of the customer and respect the rights of the customer. And secondly, it has ensured consistency. I think traditionally, the public trustee is quite a complex institution with various service lines and processes. But I think having a single decision-making framework for all of our decisions in regard to financial administration customers has meant that there's a real set of consistent values, a real set of consistent processes and guidelines to help guide our staff's decisions, working with the customer and supporting the customer's decisions. So that's been a really exciting feature for us. And related to that is really the third area where the supported decision-making has really helped our customers and our staff, and that is giving them confidence that what they're doing is actually helping customers, and giving them confidence that their work really matters and that the customer feels increasingly empowered that they themselves are actually making the decisions. So this has been a real shift for us, and you can notice it when you travel the regions or walk the floors across the organisation. You really sense staff being a lot more confident about what they're doing, as well as hearing about customers and talking to customers who actually feel more empowered and more involved in their case, which is great. And ultimately, for all of us, it means that we do what we're here for, and that is, give greater dignity for our customers, and that means that at the end of the day, they are the centre of all financial decision making relating to them, and they have a voice wherever possible, and they contribute wherever possible. And our data indicates that we are achieving better levels of customer satisfaction through the implementation of this framework. And there are individual circumstances where we do have to make or follow a structured decision-making process so as to ensure that all of their rights are protected. But we will do that with them, and we do that, as Professor Bigby explained, in a way where we do exercise substituted judgment, but ultimately designed to ensure that the customer's wishes and preferences are applied to the decisions. And overall, in terms of a benefit, it has really meant that we do get better outcomes. And the better outcomes include a greater sense of ownership of decisions by our customers. It means a better experience by our customers and support networks. Our people are more confident, and we just make better holistic decisions that consider all of the circumstances. Now, there will be individual situations where we can always do better, but I think overall, what I've noticed, and our data confirms this, as I said before, is that we are making better decisions. We are making decisions that consider more options, that consider what is ultimately the customer's view. We may think this might be the best way to go, but what does the customer think? And really letting that be the guide as much as possible. So overall, what we're really seeing is a tangible benefit to the organisation, and we're supporting it by a range of other things across the organisation to ensure that it is embedded in our DNA and continues to be embedded in our DNA. So we've got a really strong training program supporting it. All of our frontline staff do get training when they come into the organisation in regard to this process. As well as that, they get regular refreshers. We've got a host of material and information and refresher material on our intranet site, as well as a range of videos, exercises, discussion opportunities. And in addition to those things, we do have other parts of the organisation continuing to support this process through our new customer advocate office, through amendments to our digital and ICT environment. For example, making changes to our data system so that information about the customer becomes more readily available, so that when staff do make those decisions, they can quickly get to know their customer and their background, and then use that as a basis to do further exploration with the customer and support network. So overall, I think it's really had some positive benefits, at least for us on the ground, and we're doing everything necessary to ensure that it is embedded in the DNA of the organisation. And the data seems to indicate that there is a very encouraging outcome arising from this framework. So for me, I might just end it there and throw it back to you, Meg, in terms of any questions you may have or anything Professor Bigby would like to add as part of that.
Thanks for that, Samay. Professor Bigby, I think, was going to talk to some of the evaluations that have actually been undertaken of what's been happening with the public trustee and the supported decision-making or structured decision-making framework, as it's called under the legislation. So I might throw back to Professor Bigby, and then we can open up for some questions.
All right, thank you. If I can have the next slide. So I might do this just fairly quickly and then open it up for questions. We did an evaluation in which was finished in 2021, and we asked staff, what do they think about the new framework that they've been using? Do they use it in their everyday work? And has the staff practice actually shifted? We did a survey of staff before they were trained, and then 3 to 6 months after they'd done the training. And we used a measure which is now quite a valid measure, which measures change in decision support practice to see whether it's more aligned with a rights-based approach. And we used a measure too about confidence of support for decision-making. And we interviewed a number of staff about their experiences of using the framework. It was a problem in terms of COVID and the amount of response we were able to get from staff. It was a small study, but we had 50 pre and post staff who completed the confidence rating, and we had 29 staff who completed both parts of the DSQ, and we did 18 interviews with staff. So, you know, in terms of evaluation, that's not a bad set of numbers. It could be much bigger, but it's still some fairly robust findings. Next slide, please. So what did we find? What we found was very much aligned with what Samay's talked about from his experience of what's happening on the ground. So our data confirms his perceptions that staff increased significantly in their confidence of providing people in supporting decisions and providing support to people to make their own decisions. And they changed their support practice significantly, so it was more consistent with the principles and strategies of supported decision-making. So they were more likely to consider the consequences of the outcome with the person, so to think about the options and the consequences with the person, to seek advice from colleagues, to check that the person wanted to make a decision and wanted to be supported, to rely on what the person wanted or preferred, to weigh up the advantages and the disadvantages of the options with the person, to check the person understood what was involved, to work through the steps with each person, the steps of the decision process with each person, and to consider the significance of the decision. And they were much less likely then to just choose for the person what they thought was right based on their knowledge of the person. So there was a much stronger checking in with the person than previously. So, you know, the data statistically shows there was a change in the way that the staff that we participated in the surveys were doing their work. And we collected a lot of qualitative data too from the interviews, which were very much aligned with this. And one of the interesting sort of things that stuck with us was staff said they've got the wheel, the diagram, and the diagram is almost on every computer, you know, stuck on the screens so that people can see it, and they're using it as a sort of check-in process. Have we followed this? So it's become sort of embedded in what the staff felt they were doing. So it's being used by the staff. And they talked about, we're now talking to customers. You know, we actually get to know and to interact with customers, and we no longer see customers as files, which is what was happening before. So a file would get passed from one person to the one officer to the next, and nobody really knew the customers. So I think those changes are really very significant in a large sort of public organisation like the Queensland Public Trustee. There is a report that's available that's got all of the data and all of the illustrations of the changes. So can I just have the last slide? So it's very clear, I think, that the perception amongst the staff that we talked to was that Queensland Public Trustee had refocused the way it did business, was much more customer-centred and orientated towards people's rights. And there was a perception from staff that there was much greater accountability in their decision-making and their support to customers and to the organisation, because staff were now having to document the process that they'd gone through. So they felt there was a clear process and a set of principles to guide their work, which they really hadn't had before. But there were some tensions amongst staff, some of whom wanted to follow a more procedural approach and felt that the training and the framework wasn't prescriptive enough. And that's obviously in tension with the idea of being person-centred, which requires you to apply principles and processes to the unique situation of every customer and every decision. So there's some work to do in terms of helping staff understand that they've got to be person-centred, and that's what this is about. It's not just a bureaucratic procedure that they have to follow. There's clearly a need, from the feedback from the staff, there's a need for more case studies and more exemplars of some of the very complex issues that do confront frontline staff at QPT. And I think they've done, the training people have done some more of that, applying the framework to the particular situation of QPT. So I think the challenge, as Samay said, and from a research point of view, is to try and maintain the momentum and embed this way of doing support over time within the organisation, so it becomes a part of induction. There's regular refresher courses, and maybe that there's also some advanced training for supervisors and for more senior decision supporters. It's a small sample relatively, and what we would suggest is that, can these findings be replicated in 2 or 3 years' time? Has it stuck? Is it being sustained in the organisation? And I think having another round of research would really help to cement that sense that things have changed and it's been sustained. And I think the other important thing that I know Samay's very interested in, and we are too as researchers, is sharing this approach with other public trustee organisations in other states that are doing very, very similar work and should be able to apply this process to their work, even though some of the legislation is slightly different. So I might leave it there, Meg. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bigby and Samay, for sharing not only the supported decision-making framework, but the work the public trustee has undertaken in enacting that and putting that into procedure. I can see the links with the Human Rights Act here, particularly this focus on individual decision-making. That's a key focus. That's a key focus within the Human Rights Act. And it's that important consideration of considering people as individuals in our decision-making. We can't apply a one-size-fits-all approach to the decision-making we make about them. I was going to open it up for any questions. We have the Q&A box if anyone wanted to put any questions in. There was a question that came through on the chat function, Samay, that I was going to read out to you. It looks like we've got two. So the first question is, knowing the person, unfortunately, stop and reflect may sustain decision-making backgrounding a person's circumstances rather than foregrounding. For First Nations people, this approach can then further embed structural bias and racism in agencies responsible for policing, prison, health, and any agency responsible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. What steps will the public trustee take to ensure the framework delivers better outcomes for all Queenslanders? Consider access to deceased estates in a timely manner in current circumstances where UPLA collapsed, taking decades of First Nations people's funeral funds.
So, look, thank you for the question. Now, in terms of the processes for us, we ensure that, as part of this process, it's really about getting to know the customer and the customer's situation as it is at the moment. So obviously that does mean some reflection on the customer's journey so far, but ultimately the focus is on knowing the customer as they are and knowing their context, knowing their wishes and preferences and goals and aspirations. So for us, that's at the forefront of this model and at the forefront of the associated guidelines that we've developed around it to ensure that we do consider the customer as a whole person and their circumstance as a whole person. We've also ensured that organisationally we do continue to put in processes and changes to ensure that the customers, not only for our financial administration customers, but all of our customers, including deceased state customers, including our trust customers, including other customers in the area of wills and enduring powers of attorney, that they're all at the centre of everything that we do. So 2 years ago, we implemented our customer first agenda, and that's our primary organisational strategy and vision going forward, which is really putting the customer at the heart of everything we do. So that involved making a number of critical changes to the organisation. One of those things was a new structure, which was really about making sure that we got all of our customer functions together and working for the customer coherently, collectively, and passionately. We also established, as I said before, a customer advocate function. So that's a function that's a first for the sector in Australia. And that function is really designed to help support all of our customers, including our First Nations customers, to ensure that their voices are heard in the organisation, as well as everything else that we do organisationally. But this customer advocate is there to support all of our customers should they have any blockages or challenges with the system. This customer advocate function is there to support them. We've also introduced a financial independence pathway. Now, again, this is one of the first in the sector. It's a structured pathway where we work with our customers and their support networks to help them achieve financial independence, rather than necessarily be in the guardianship and administration system. So through this pathway, what we do is we ensure that our customers are supported, are fully empowered to get on with their lives without necessarily having us involved in their lives. And that has been a wonderful success so far. I think so far we've achieved about 14 customers who've achieved full independence, and we've got over 70 customers going through that pathway. So through those mechanisms and through many more under our customer first agenda, we're really making some pioneering changes organisationally. There will always be room for improvement, but for us, you know, we're at a critical period of transformation, and that's why, you know, we are doing forums such as this to hear what some of those views are. And as well, we've also established a customer reference group so that we continue to hear customers' voices, stakeholder voices, and let that help drive some of the changes we want to make organisationally and for the sector. So I might leave it there.
I can't see any other questions, but people can raise their hand and I can also allow them to talk if that's easier from this side of the fence. I had a question going on what Professor Bigby had said around a further evaluation. Is that something the public trustee might be open to considering in 2 to 4 years' time, that further evaluation of the method to see what's happening with the decision-making framework, what's been implemented, what changes may need to happen, or where things go from here?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Meg. And the short answer is that yes. And the long answer is that you know, Professor Bigby and I have, and our organisation have been in continual discussions about how to continually improve the process, and that has involved, you know, discussions about how we can do that. And we're really excited to do that, because for us, this is not a burden. This is something we really want to do. This is something we really value, and this is something we want to ensure succeeds organisationally, because we think it has enormous potential to enable the voices of our customers to be heard. And I think it has enormous potential for the sector, not only in Queensland, but nationally as well. So that can only mean better outcomes for Queenslanders and Australians. So we're very excited to continue to work with Professor Bigby and do that second and potentially third round of evaluations. Here she's got her hand up, so I think she wants to say a few words as well.
No, I just wanted to go back to the first question. I think it's very important. We've just finished quite a significant piece of work for the Royal Commission about supported decision making. And what's really clear is that there is almost no evidence, and our framework certainly didn't involve people from First Nations backgrounds. And there's a sense that there's a very different cultural set of expectations about supported decision making, because it's much more community-based, shared decision making than just focused around the individual, which most of obviously Western culture has been. So I think there's a huge need to really understand more about supported decision making from First Nations people, and to get their perspectives about a model that might work for them in their cultural context. So I think that's another sort of piece of work that is really quite urgent at the moment as supported decision making becomes more embedded in organisations. What does it look like for people from First Nations backgrounds? And the other thing, I think there's a question in the chat about confidentiality, and if you're doing orchestration and doing advocacy and involving other people in supporting a person to make decisions, obviously that's with the person's consent and agreement about who they think is in their support network and who should be involved in providing support. And where there is family conflict, then it's obviously up to the person themselves who is consulted and who is part of that network. Maybe you might want to add something to that, Samay.
Look, I think I agree with everything you're saying. So we do have a range of obligations, both under the Guardianship and Administration Act, Information Privacy Act, the Public Trustee Act regarding confidentiality, regarding privacy. So we do adhere to those. But ultimately for us, it's really letting the customer drive some of those conversations. Making sure that if we there's a clear opportunity to involve the broader support for the customer, getting the customer's preferences and views about who they want involved, how they might want them involved, and all of those things. So we really try to work with the customer in terms of some of those conversations, but always very cognizant of those broader obligations. And I think relatedly, it's really about having these ongoing conversations throughout. So some of these conversations or these things are not a point in time. And I think, as Professor Bigby said, you don't do just something at the beginning and forget about it. For us, these are continuing conversations, going back and forth, testing, hearing, listening, and then adjusting and moving forward. So for us, it's a continual process, an iterative process of making sure that ultimately it's about the individual. And I think it's been a huge, for us, a huge cultural shift. We've still got a long way to go in terms of some of the cultural opportunities we have available, but I think it's on the ground in terms of when I go and talk to staff and customers, we are noticing some noticeable positive changes there, including.
I've got one question in the chat box and then we will have to wrap things up given the time. So the question is, within my work as a financial counsellor, I find it difficult to help a client work through their financial decision-making process when I can see some red flags to their safety and financial security within their present decisions. How would I support these types of clients to gain the support they need if there are red flags within their potential ability to make safe financial decisions by themselves?
So there's a number of mechanisms. So obviously there's formal mechanisms in terms of potentially seeking to have a financial administrator appointed through QCAT, and that can be the public trustee or it can be another person. But I think it's also talking to the individual, getting their views, seeing whether there's a broader support network available for the individual that can work and support them. And also, I think continuing to keep the customer informed and engaged and aware of the risks and opportunities to make changes. I think you can't forget about the customer having some sort of voice in this. But I think just following those general principles, obviously first, trying to work with the customer, getting their views, involving their broader support network. And if it continues to be an issue or a challenge posing some real risks, looking at some of those more formal options if necessary.
And if I might just add, it's also thinking about what constitutes risk, who thinks it's a risk, and is there a way to enable people to take risks so that they can follow through on their preferences, but with the minimum amount of harm or negative outcomes. So there's lots of ways of managing that, and there is another set of training around how you enable people to take risks. So I think that there's lots of areas there that could be addressed. It's not straightforward. Sorry, Meg.
No, that's okay. I was also just going to add that if there are genuine concerns around a person being abused financially or emotionally and they have impaired capacity, the public guardian also has an investigative function that can investigate allegations of abuse, neglect and exploitation in certain circumstances too. But I would also reiterate everything Samay and Professor Bigby have said around those issues of consent for people and engaging with them as well. We're right on time now, so I wanted to say a massive thank you to Professor Bigby and to Samay for not only making themselves available, but for talking to us on the supported decision-making framework, and Samay especially for talking about the steps the public trustee has taken and the journey that you're on at the present time, because it feels like a journey to me. It's a positive journey. I can see the connections with the Human Rights Act in decision-making and the openness to look at what more can be done and the steps we need to take as well around this. We've just put up a quick poll. If you would like to contribute to that, this just helps us with our presentations at QCOS to know what information you enjoyed, and if you'd like to hear further information. We will send out a post-event email as well that will include the slides, a number of references from Professor Bigby as well. I'll also link into that the report that LaTrobe University undertook on the evaluation of the public trustees' structured decision-making framework too. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today and for attending. And again, thank you, Professor Bigby and Samay, for being available and participating in our webinar.
Thanks for having us.
Really enjoyed it.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Okay, go.